I'm here today with David Gamage, who is a professor specializing in tax law. And David and I have a bit of a history back when I used to work as a economic advisor for Senator Warren, including on her presidential campaign. I worked with David and with some other professors, including Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman at Berkeley, to design what became Senator Warren's wealth tax proposal during that campaign, which um, generated a lot of interest and excitement, and also generated a lot of critiques and controversy. And since then, David has gone off and has been working with folks at SEIU in California to design the billionaire tax, wealth tax proposal that they are trying to get on the ballot for this coming November. And I suspect many of you are following this already, but it has generated lots of excitement and interest, like the Warren proposal, and also has led to a lot of critiques and concerns from the billionaire community, billionaire Americans, I guess, and also other folks in California, including the governor, Gavin Newsom, a Democrat, who has said that he has concerns and would oppose this proposal. So I thought it would be fun to have David come on, talk a little bit about the proposal, try to respond to some of the critiques that have been raised, and then talk more generally about wealth taxes and revenue. So, David, thanks for coming on. And maybe you can just start by, for those who aren't following it particularly closely, explaining how this California proposal works.
Absolutely. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me say before I forget that I'm here speaking only on behalf of myself and not on behalf of SEIU or the campaign in any way. It's also, I think, worth emphasizing that although this proposal, I think, is going to succeed and pass more likely than not, and is getting a lot of attention as a result, it's building on a series of proposals at various state levels, including multiple prior wealth tax proposals introduced in the California legislature that got to various stages, proposals that my co-authors and I worked on in other states, and several federal level proposals, including President Biden's billionaire minimum income tax reform proposal that my co-authors and I helped draft the legislative version of. So this is building on a series of reform proposals that, really started in some ways with Senator Warren's wealth tax that, as you said, we worked on. This one specifically is designed to raise funds to address the expected healthcare emergency coming in California. So as background, when SEIU Union in California approached my co-authors and I on designing something, their specific concern is federal cuts, especially the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the as you know, because in CACs we like to try to pronounce things and it's impossible with that one. My students laugh when I do that, right? Slashed Medicaid funding, slashed Affordable Care Act subsidies, and the impact expected in California is quite dramatic. And there's no other solution to that impact, which is predicted to have real harm to California's health ecosystem, along with cuts to education and various other assistance programs. This is the only proposal out there in California that would address and counteract those shortfalls. So because this is viewed as a one-time emergency caused by federal slashing of funding with very little warning, it's designed as a one-time tax to meet that emergency. A billionaire only on billionaires. So it's somewhere between 200 and 300 taxpayers in California expected. California has the largest concentration of billionaires, depending how you count such things, anywhere in the world. So in California, that raises potentially a substantial amount of money, enough to offset this funding crisis for healthcare and for other California priorities. Of course, could get a lot more into the details, but why don't I turn it back to you for the last question?
So I think that there's a few important things to spotlight there. Number one, as you said, this is a one-time tax to fill a hole that was created by the National Republican Party effort to slash federal funding for Medicaid, right? So Medicaid works in partnership with the states. The federal government provides a lot of funding for the states to then implement Medicaid, I should say. And in the Trump tax bill that passed last year, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, I also get embarrassed saying that. They slashed federal funding as part of a broader package to massively cut taxes for the very wealthy.
Mhm.
And that created holes, Medicaid holes in all of these state budgets, including in California. And now states have to scramble to figure out how to fill that hole. Or the alternative is not filling that hole and letting a lot of people, low income people, lose Medicaid, which
And
would
not
be,
just low income people, because we're talking the Affordable Care Act
oh,
subsidies. Yeah, this is expected to have broad impact. We're expecting rural hospitals closing, expecting lots of people to lose health service.
yeah. And so I want to um, emphasize that point because whenever we talk, we meaning, policy people, people involved in politics, talk about taxes, there's this very there's a deep focus on trade-offs. Oh, if you tax this, you'll get less of this activity. It could lead to this kind of consequence, that kind of consequence. But there's also trade-offs that we're talking about on the other side of this, which is that if we don't try to fill this hole right now in California, a lot of people are going to lose Medicaid, right? So I just want people to have that in mind as they, or you have to come up with some other way of filling that gap. And that may mean generating tax dollars from middle class families, working class people, or taxing commercial property. There's all sorts of things that are also going to have impact. So that's important to keep this in mind. Can you say a little bit about the design of it? So, for example, on the war and wealth tax that we worked on, and this is key, we're talking about wealth, right? This is not about income. This is the total net worth that an individual has. The war and wealth tax was structured so that it only applied to people who had over $50 million in wealth. And it was a 2% tax on any dollar of wealth over that. So if you had 50 million and $1 in net worth, you would pay 2 cents, right? Because that first 50 million is exempt. Can you describe in the same way what's the sort of exemption amount here and what's the tax rate that we're talking about in this instance?
Yeah, let me make one point first, sponsored by some of what you were saying. It's important to understand why tax wealth and billionaires. Part of the argument is also California has a high top marginal income tax rate compared to other states,
Right.
13.3%. But this rate is minimally effective as compared to billionaires. For someone who is, say, a surgeon or a well compensated physician or employee, California collects quite high taxes. This is what you might call the ordinary rich, because that excuse me, I have a little bit of cough today. Ordinary income tax rate applies to most labor income. By contrast, if you're looking at billionaires and ultra wealthy more generally, but especially billionaires, almost all by by studies, all of the economic income, you might say, or wealth accumulations are gained in a way that is minimally subject to California's income tax. So the best studies I've seen suggest that only maybe a quarter or less of the wealth accumulation of the typical supermillionaire or a billionaire is ever going to be subject to any tax rate. And that's going to be less at the state level than the federal level. So we're talking about a group here who is not paying the same effective tax rates again that the ordinary rich, the well-compensated surgeon might be. So then to the dynamics of the tax. So there's no exemption amount. What there is it applies only to billionaires and the tax rate phases in between 1 billion of wealth and about 1.5 billion of wealth to avoid cliff effects. So for someone who has 2 billion or more of wealth, it's going to be a 5% one-time tax rate on all the wealth, except there's some exceptions. No real property is accepted for various reasons. Certain forms of retirement savings accounts are accepted, but it's going to capture a base of the vast majority of real net worth of most billionaires. Um, there's an optional deferral mechanism that applies to what I like to think of as true paper billionaires. So if someone has more than 95% of their net worth in non-publicly traded assets, non-cash equivalents, non-traded equivalents, they can choose if they want to opt into this optional deferral mechanism. And California's tax claim then vests based on anything taken out of that optional deferral account. So there's no tax paid until distributions. That could, if the founder of Paper Billionaires ends up being the next Google, California could get a lot more in the future
Right.
because it's based on withdrawals. On the other hand, if the startup evaporates, then there's no tax claim. So
Yep.
the founder can choose whether or not to give California what's nominally equivalent of a minority share interest, although it has no control rights. But that's only available to any billionaire with less than who has more than 95% of their net worth in non-traded assets. And the
Yep.
reason there is simple. We have this healthcare emergency, right? If I was designing my perfect billionaire tax with no constraints, I would, this optional deferral mechanism builds on scholarship that two of my co-authors and I in this proposal developed at length. And we proposed a more available version in President Biden's billionaire minimum income tax reform proposal. But here, it generates less revenue to address the healthcare emergency. So a choice was made balancing the interests of billionaire taxpayers versus healthcare needs to make a more restrictive version of the optional deferral account available.
Yep.
So generally, most billionaires are going to be expected to pay a 5% one-time tax based on their net worth as assessed at the end of 2026, assuming this passes, payable over 5 years, so effectively 1% a year, but then with an interest charge, so it ends up in subsequent years being a little bit more than 1% if they opt to pay it over 5 years.
Got it. Yeah. So just, to put that in concrete terms, if you're fortunate enough to be worth $20 billion, you would pay $1 billion, and you could basically opt to pay that over a 5-year period, or you could opt to pay it all in one lump sum. Now,
Yep.
I want to, and this is an important point. It is not only a one-time tax, but it is based on your residency in California as of 2025, right? Through the end of 2025. Is that
Well,
correct?
specifically January 1, 2026.
Wait. Okay.
But
So if you are subject to the tax if you are a resident of California on that date. So let me, with that set up, let me start with giving you a chance to respond to some of the concerns that have been raised about this, including, like I said, from the Democratic governor of the state, Gavin Newsom. The first is, and we would hear this all the time on the Warren campaign about her wealth tax. There's this kind of philosophical objection to taxing wealth, right? There is this concept that we can tax income. If you receive wages, you have that money, you can be taxed on it. We think about it the same way when it comes to capital gains, right? If you just hold the stock, nothing happens. But when you sell the stock and maybe you realize a gain of $1,000 on those shares, then you're subject to a tax on that realization, right? The actual income that you brought in from it. But taxing wealth, which is this thing that exists, quote unquote, on paper, but may not exist in liquid form, is something that is outside the American tradition. That's a phrase that I've heard people talk about. How do you respond to that kind of philosophical or ideological objection?
yeah, several things I'd say. One, most middle income and upper middle class Californians pay a very heavy wealth tax on the primary source of wealth that they own, their real property. We've had real property taxes we have them in every state. They are wealth taxes. They only apply to a limited base, although many states have personal property taxes also. There used to be general wealth taxes, by the way, and those predated income taxes. It's categorically wrong to say that wealth taxes aren't part of the American tradition. They predate income taxes as part of the American tradition. But as the economy evolved to be less agricultural, the general wealth taxes based on the technology of that day were thought not to work well. And thus we had the rise of income taxes,
Right.
Which at that time worked much better and still do. But the economy is evolving once again. And the realization-based income taxes, which work quite well for professionals, for most Americans, honestly, but work quite poorly when we're talking about super millionaires and billionaires with financial income flows and income flows that can largely escape existing income taxes in perpetuity. We need a better solution. Now,
Yeah.
I like to talk with my tax friends about mark-to-market income tax reforms versus wealth taxes and a variety. And there's pros and cons of a lot of different ways to address these things. But for a ballot measure in California, we need something understandable by the average voter. And average voters understand what a wealth tax is. This is in some ways the genius of the Warren proposal. Voters understood what it meant and supported it in high levels by all polls, where other academic proposals for income tax reform are much harder to communicate to voters. And in a world where there's intense opposition by special interest groups, and the wealthy, and our legislative proposals didn't go very far in California, and the ballot measure is needed as a way to overcome that, I dare say, capture of the legislative democratic process by special interest groups and wealthy, at least to some extent. You need something that's easily understood by the average American, and a wealth tax is. They understand it because they know what property taxes are, they're familiar with that, and they understand how it works.
Yeah. So I would say that the main substantive objection that I have heard and read about this proposal is that it will it's relatively straightforward to evade. Now, then this is how I would describe that. The federal wealth tax proposal that I worked on the Warren campaign, we were very concerned about potential evasion, and we looked at the application of wealth taxes in other countries, mostly in Europe, where there was some evidence that, for example, they imposed a wealth tax in France. In France, taxes are based on your residency. And so what happened was that a bunch of the very rich people in France packed up and they moved to Belgium or Luxembourg or whatever, and they escaped the application of the tax. And they also took, the other taxes that they paid with them, right? They weren't paying property taxes and sales taxes in France anymore because they moved to a different country. And so for the Warren wealth tax, we thought about how to address that. The interesting thing in the United States is that our taxes are based on citizenship, not on residency. So if you're an American citizen and you live in Singapore, you're still paying American taxes to a certain degree. And so the only way to escape the wealth tax would have been to renounce your citizenship. So we essentially imposed an exit tax that said if you renounce your citizenship after this tax goes into effect, you pay a one-time very large wealth tax. Okay, so that's how we thought about the evasion issue. With the California tax, it seems to me like the main anti-evasion method is the fact that it's retroactive, right? So it's based on
I,
residency on January 1st, 2026, which has already passed.
I would disagree with that.
Okay. Yes. So I'm curious how you would respond to people who say, number one, um, a state level wealth tax might be easier to evade because you can just move, and number two, that even if this is styled as a one-time wealth tax, people will be afraid that it could be applied again. And so they're
Mhm.
going to pack up and move to, Nevada or Arizona or Texas or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I'd say a few things.
Yep.
One, there absolutely is a literature. So I should say, in a world in which we had a choice of a state level or a federal level wealth tax equally well designed, I think there's a strong case that a federal wealth tax would be better. Of
Yep.
course, we don't live in that world for very obvious reasons. Uh, uh, so the question then is, can a state level wealth tax be designed effectively? And let's abstract from the California proposal and imagine we're talking about an ongoing wealth tax just for this thought experiment, right? So I'd say the most successful wealth tax in the world is Switzerland's. It has been in existence for over 100 years, generally considered a mainstay successful part of the Swiss wealth tax system. It's canton level. Cantons are their equivalents of states.
Yep.
There's been a lot of studies on mobility responses, and some find some responses, but it's relatively small. Spain recently, there's a complicated history here, but revived and strengthened its province level wealth tax, and the top rate in some provinces is 3.75% annually. That's much, much higher than the annual equivalent level we're talking about in California, which mid-annual would be 1% over 5 years, right? There are some reported mobility responses by the literature, but they're actually quite small. The other thing we find quite consistently, and this gets back to the Spanish and the literature, if it's easy to say that you've changed your location of residence based on, say, buying a house in another jurisdiction or not really moving physically. You see large mobility responses. And, some of the early wealth taxes were designed poorly in a way that was easy to do that. And we saw large wealth tax mobility responses. But when tax residency rule and its capture of financial assets is designed so you have to actually move out of jurisdiction. We have a massive literature here, and the literature consistently finds very small mobility responses. So based on that literature, I expect an ongoing wealth tax in California of, say, 1% a year or even larger would have small mobility responses. That doesn't mean zero. Now, the follow-up question, which is, what do we make of all this media reporting of everyone supposedly having already left? Well, this is a very familiar pattern.
Yep.
When Massachusetts passed its millionaire tax, all sorts of wealthy people said they were leaving. The research now finds they didn't. When Mamdani was elected in New York City, all these wealthy people said they were going to leave. They haven't. When Washington State passed its capital gains excise tax, all these wealthy people said they were going to leave. The media reported it. They haven't. Norway is an interesting example. They strengthened and raised the rate of their wealth tax, and there was a massive amount of reporting of people leaving Norway, and a few did. But now that a few years have passed and we have literature, we find that the actual mobility response in terms of revenue and other economic impact is quite small, and the revenue raising by Norway has been quite good, and Norway's economy is doing well compared to neighbors.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between what people say they do in the media. If you look at these media stories, various wealthy people say they moved some businesses, they bought a house in Miami. None of those things under California law suffice to change residence. California, for income tax purposes, has a very robust and well-enforced set of residency rules, and it's not easy to change your residence out of California without actually moving your whole life. And then and very few people actually do that, despite what they say in the media.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And I thank you for raising that literature because I think it is powerfully important. And it is, like you said, a constant refrain whenever you have any proposal that is targeted at the very wealthy. That will lead to a massive evasion response. And as you said, the empirical literature suggests that that's not true. Now, is there an argument that something could be so onerous that maybe it would prompt a response? Sure. But at the end of the day, there's lots of reasons why people want to reside in California, why they want their business to be located in California. And you have to hit some kind of pretty high threshold, I'm guessing, in order to overcome those other inducements for California. Um, in the time that we have left, I want to raise a couple other responses from or sort of critiques uh, in the legal area, because just again to explain the process here, there is an effort to put this on the ballot for November 2026. You have to gather, I think it's about 900,000 signatures, I think it is, in the state. That's something that I think should be relatively straightforward, given the power that the sort of the popularity of this and the muscle that's behind it. Um, if it's then approved by, is it just a majority of voters? It's 50% threshold. Okay, so if it's approved by a majority of voters come November, um, a lot of folks are saying, okay, there's going to be an immediate legal process to challenge this on various grounds. So you are a law professor, so let me tee some of these up for you. The two main arguments that I've seen are, one, that because it is retroactive, right? It is based on your residence at a time before when the law was enacted. Um, it somehow is violative of due process interests that taxpayer may have. And I think a variation of that, but a different argument, is that it represents an unconstitutional taking of someone's property. Okay, so let me tee those two up for you, and would be curious for your responses on those.
Yeah. I'll start with the second because it's easier. The taking argument is effectively a tax protester argument. Courts have consistently rejected arguments of this sort. as raised with many, many different tax proposals over the history of this country and rejected them with strong prejudice. This is that real attorneys of real clients are raising this type of argument as it's one thing to say it as political rhetoric. People can say whatever they want as political rhetoric, free speech, but to suggest that the courts would take this seriously shows how weak their overall case is. The due process argument is not a tax protester argument of by tax protester, I mean, this, for any reader, anyone listening who doesn't understand what I'm referring to, right? There's people out there who say that the income taxes are inconstitutional and they refuse to pay, or there's all sorts of dubious arguments that are being thrown around and people end up in jail. And this is just a shorthand of way of saying completely nonsense arguments that people nonetheless circulate. Supreme Court case law says very strongly that generally you can go back at least a year, and sometimes in terms of how far, retroactive impact of tax reforms, and sometimes as much as 2 years or beyond. The typical practice in California tax propositions has been to go back to January 1. Prop 30, for instance, which was enacted, went back to January 1, and we modeled it after that. Now, this is not a tax protester argument because in the sense of the following, right? Standard Supreme Court case law blesses, under most circumstances, going back a year, and would go back less than a year, and suggests that you can go back more than a year, and has blessed going back more than a year on a number of occasions. And in fact, a number of anti-tax California propositions go back a year or more also. This is standard practice. But, Supreme Court case law is also somewhat vague. So we feel I'll say, speaking only for myself, I feel very comfortable that going back to January 1 for something that'll be voted on in November is consistent with all federal Supreme Court case law, and California case law is consistent with the standard practice. But it's not inconceivable that the Supreme Court or some court might take action based on that. And we have language in the act which would adjust the date based on whatever was decided. So I would say it's unlikely, but not completely implausible, that the Supreme Court or a federal court might delay the date of enactment of it for residency purposes beyond January 1.
Got it. Great. We are approaching our half an hour. I want to end with this, which is to go back to something you talked about earlier, which is the kind of the founder's wealth on paper, right? Obviously, we're talking about California, talking about Silicon Valley. There's lots and lots of people who found startups there. They go up in valuation. They're worth $1 billion on paper. They get funding at a certain valuation. And then it goes bust. Some of them hit it big, but some of them just disappear after a year or two. Can you explain again, just because I think it's really worth emphasizing, how do you handle those cases, right? So let's take person founds a startup 2 years later, it's worth $1 billion. Their interest in it is worth $1 billion, let's say $5 billion on paper. First of all, this is rare, right? So we should emphasize that this is not happening to everybody who lives in Silicon Valley. But let's say they found something that goes to $5 billion on paper, and then 2 years later, it just goes bust. Okay, how does the tax handle that situation? Number one, and then number two, how do you respond to arguments that even though this is one time, that the fact that this happened once is going to deter people from wanting to try to found their firm in California in the future?
Yeah. Let me say something before directly answering your question. There has been a lot of misinformation circulating, and by misinformation, I mean clearly against facts, and can be dispelled by anyone who reads the language of the act, although it's written in legalese, or if you don't have an attorney who can read it for you and you're not an attorney, you can ask any good AI program to read it for you. And the fact that people are circulating this misinformation is somewhat driving me crazy. This seems to have started with Gary Tan, who's a San Francisco tech person, who claims that his specific claim is that Google founders will be valued based on their voting control instead of their economic interests. So, one, for any publicly traded assets, the valuation rule is market trading price at the end of the year. Done. Straightforward. Two, for privately held assets, is a combination of a presumptive formula that taxpayers can use where it works. This is based on the Swiss model, which has been successful, or they can submit a certified appraisal if they don't want to use the formulas. If the formulas don't work for them. So there's a default formula which says that for the purpose of the default formula, valuation of privately held assets in businesses can't be less than voting control. But it's just and that's what he's pointing at, but it's just a default formula. And it's very easy to submit an appraisal. That's the common practice for the federal estate and gift tax. Right. So that isn't quite your question, but I think it's important to dispel that misinformation. And anyone who has in doubt, read the act or feed it into an AI, or my co-authors and I have an explainer available on SSRN. Feed that into the act is available, and you could read the language. So back to your actual questions. We have the optional deferral account for the true paper billionaire. So for anyone who has 95% of their net worth or more in non-traded assets, they can opt into the optional deferral account. That's one answer. For someone who has more of their net worth in publicly traded assets, we think any such billionaire has the ability to sell assets, borrow against them, or take distributions. And yeah, there might be some hardship in the same sense that many of middle class and ordinary rich Californians find it difficult to pay their property taxes. But there's a balance here. There's also going to be massive hardship for all the Californians who are going to lose healthcare and closing of rural hospitals if something isn't done. Yeah. So it goes back to, in an ideal world, I would love to extend the optional deferral account more broadly, but there's a trade-off between raising revenue to address real hardship and collecting revenue from people who are true billionaires who have more than enough in publicly traded assets to pay the tax, but might just not want to. And such true billionaires can easily borrow, all the literature says, if they don't want to sell their shares. Yeah. Do we have time for the
Yes. No, but let me wrap things up here, because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I want to end where I started. First of all, thank you for this. This has been extremely illuminating. There's always trade-offs on any policy pathway, and when one chooses a pathway that involves raising taxes on very, very rich people, they have the benefit of a massive megaphone where they can go on Bloomberg and CNBC and Squawk Box and CNN and tweet it out to their hundreds of thousands of followers that this is an outrage, and it's going to lead to the collapse of the innovation ecosystem in California. It's going to lead to a mass exodus of every wealthy person in California, and it gets into the echo chamber. I don't want to. I'm sure that there will be some trade-offs if this is implemented, but as you noted, there are known trade-offs on the other side, which is that if California doesn't fill this budget hole, a lot of people are going to lose Medicaid, and that's going to have very dire consequences for them financially, have consequences for them for their health, and if there are other alternatives that California can consider to fill that hole, those are going to have trade-offs too. Maybe it's going to be increasing the tax burden on more middle-class people. Maybe it's going to mean cutting back on spending for housing programs and nutrition programs or other things like that, which is going to come with consequences. So I would just say to folks who are watching this, who will end up watching it, who may think that this is the worst idea in the world, think about, first of all, listen to David's arguments, which I thought were quite persuasive. But second of all, think about what the trade-offs are here. And I feel like it's incumbent on people who may have opposition to this to put forward an alternative that tries to address some of these problems. And I suspect that that's also going to have some winners and some losers. And if somebody can explain, why the losers should be middle-class families or people who rely on Medicaid or people who rely on the ACA rather than people who have been very, very lucky and very, very fortunate and very, very successful, good luck to you in trying to make that argument, I suppose. David, thank you so much for taking the time, and we'll talk soon.
Great. Thank you.